Friends, allies, and Americans, welcome to the Defense of Democracy podcast, where we tell the stories of folks who defend your children's rights by advocating for inclusive public school systems and who fight for diversity across our nation. I'm your host, Karen Swoboda. Let's get into it. Welcome to the Defense of Democracy podcast. My guest today is Richard Blanco. Richard was selected by President Obama as the fifth presidential inaugural poet in U.S. history. Mr. Blanco was the youngest, the first Latinx, immigrant, and gay person to serve in this role. In 2023, Mr. Blanco was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Biden, from the National Endowment for the Humanities. He was born in Madrid to Cuban exile parents and raised in Miami in a working class family, and his personal negotiation of cultural identity and the universal themes of place and belonging characterize his many collections of poetry. So, Richard, welcome to the Defense of Democracy podcast. I am so pleased that you could make it today, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Look forward to all of it.
So I was especially honored as someone who's an English major and in my younger days dabbled in poetry. I've really found that the art of poetry and the written word has helped me in communicating to a very large audience, because when you're writing a poem, right, you're trying to condense things down into like the smallest but most impactful and emotional message. Talk to me through the eyes of someone who is a poet, who's a professional poet, and this is their job, what you see happening in our country right now and how you feel you're kind of resonating that in your work and the work that you do.
Yes, you hit the nail on the head there in terms of compression and whatnot. So I always think that poetry has is so analogous to music in the way that it can galvanize people together, or at least make people think differently. We're thinking about, people like Bob Dylan and the protest songs of the 60s and whatnot. And like music, poetry always has that kind of really powerful and compressed message, right? So that's one thing, you can capture attention in a very short time span, but also there's a lot of ripple effects of a poem, that a poem can stay with you, and you might get part of it and then you read it again and something else clicks. So that's part of it. I think part of what poetry does and what has always done, but I think also some of the arts in general, poetry sort of bears witness, and so all these issues in the news and the 24-hour newsreels that we have, that get very abstracted, very frankly, don't go into a lot of depth, right? Poetry adds a real name, a real face, a real story, whether it's my own or something I'm writing about. And I think that's powerful, because this is no longer, it's a real person in the world. It's an issue that is affecting someone, right? There's that sense of being witness to yourself, to others. So that's part of what, I think the power of poetry now. And I think we can see that over the years, poetry has become more and more important as we have been facing more and more crises and more divisiveness. So that's one thing that poetry can do. Poetry can also, in the state of affairs where we are now, poetry can also offer hope and joy, which is kind of like, I've been talking to a lot of poet friends of mine, and you'd think we'd be writing all this protest poetry, but right now we're kind of like just circling around the mountain, and we're like, we need some just plain beauty, and let's appreciate a flower, or like, let's do something that ground us first before we jump into something else, and while we're still getting our head around it and what we can do with poetry. So that's another thing in which the arts can function, and poetry in particular. Those are things that I've always, in some way, shape, or form, have felt are really at the heart of poetry.
Wow. Yeah. And I completely agree. And I think that these moments created by our artists and our teachers and are so critical right now. I also want to talk to you as a child of immigrant parents and also as a gay man. Like, there's this cross sectionality. I deal a lot with students, right? And there are students that, have a lot of these issues. You're an adult. How, how do you feel about what's happening right now to our children in school who are immigrant or who might be othered in some way?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I teach at Florida International University, and of course, incredibly diverse university. Many Latinx
Mhm.
students. It's my alma mater. That's where I went to. Working class kids. Um, so, I'm obviously feeling what's going on with them, and some of their intimidations, and some of like their just plain out fears, right? Um, what I try to do is, through my teaching and not just the writing, but also I teach a literature course,
Mhm.
is to ground them in historical context a little bit through the literature, to give them some sense of you haven't been alone throughout history, and you can be part of this history, right? That
Mhm.
you have some agency, whether it seems you don't. And I encourage them, um, use your platforms that us old dinosaurs can't use as well as you can, right?
Right.
You can have a voice and just stop posting kitten videos and do something. You can use those venues, those platforms to really, just put it out there, and I think you'll feel empowered, or at least not as you know doom and gloom. But also the historical context, right? As I always like to say, 68 wasn't a very good year, you know, and we can,
Right.
so, having some context that history does in a sense repeat itself,
Mhm.
unfortunately, but also we got to look at the positive end of how history repeats itself as well. Like there's something to be said there. So, yeah, I think the education, I mean, I think having them also just write and be creative, in the
Mhm.
face of something, whether it's on topic about something like this or not, but just pushing back and doing something, creating something in the world that is all about destroying right now,
Right.
is also, I think, an uplifting, and so it's grounding, at least, right? So always in the context of arts education. And I think also what I try to do also in outside of the classroom, to reach people everywhere, and especially the young folks, it's the idea of the public humanities, right? That we have to
Mhm.
take, we can't wait for people to come to poetry. We have to take poetry to the people. And that was kind of a lesson that not a lesson, but something I really grew into after serving as presidential inaugural poet, understanding the power of bringing poetry to people, and how so many thousands of emails that people wrote me, that they finally felt part of this country because of what the poem and because of what I represented. So the
Mhm.
idea of how poetry can also, um, you know, create that effect beyond the classroom, right? Create that sense of grounding. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, and I'm learning too. I just realized you're like only the fourth or fifth inaugural
mhm.
poet. I there had to have been one in 1993. That's when I graduated college because I was gifted the inaugural poem by that individual, and it was a woman, and I can't remember her name, but
Uh,
yeah,
uh,
it's pretty rare.
Elizabeth Alexander must have been
Yes,
there,
yes, thank you.
or
Yes.
or
No,
Maya Angelou.
no, I wish it was
Yeah.
my no, it was Elizabeth.
Yeah, my husband says more people have been to the moon than have served as inaugural poet. It's a really
Yeah.
unique class.
Um, okay, question. Did our current president have an inaugural poet this year?
No, it's a Democratic Party tradition. It
Oh, I
started with
see.
JFK and Frost. For those of you that might be interested, I had a friend put my inaugural poem into Chat GPT, and had it write a poem in the voice and the tone of Trump, as if he would have written it. And I got to tell you, it's hilarious. Like,
No. What? You don't have it you don't have it handy, do you?
it's
Probably
posted on
not.
my social media, but no, I don't have it
Alright,
handy.
well, I'll put the link. I'll tell you what, for anyone who's listening, I'm gonna put the link in the chat so that you can access that. Wow. ChatGPT. Okay. All right. So moving on to something else, and we're talking about kids and kind of their perspective and their understanding of history. Um, I was having a conversation earlier today with another individual who mentioned, there are kids out there who don't realize that marriage equality wasn't always a thing.
Right.
That blew me away,
Yeah.
right? Um, and how precious these things are when they do come to pass, and how fragile they are, because now we've got an administration that I think is would very much like to dismantle that, as they did, women's right to choose and all of that. Um, but I want to also ask, you had mentioned about the literature and the historical context. So, what kind of like books do you recommend? What do you recommend for your students to do to learn a little bit more about this? I always go to the civil rights era. That's where I take a lot of my cues in organizing.
Well, in particular, and I'll say this is mostly because I teach Latinx literature.
Mhm.
Um, there is this wonderful book that's very friendly. It's a question and answer format. It's called Everything You Need to Know About Latino History,
Mhm.
by last name Novas. And it's surprising to me, like what little they get taught in school. Like they're, for example, the Spanish American War, which is part of the reason why we're sitting in this classroom, right? Like, so, and
Mhm.
they're like just taken aback. Also, we tend to only focus, well, not only focus, but mostly about slavery in the United States, and it opens up their eyes to realize that this is not just about the United States, how much that has affected history and who we are as Latin American and Caribbean
Mhm.
descendants, or maybe more than descendants. Some students are still coming, some of them are still coming. Well, now with Venezuela, they're coming like, teenagers, and they're having to renegotiate their whole identity. So those are books that I just really, you can't understand the literature unless you have that grounding in history. Um, the other thing, again, in the context of Latino, there are a lot of Latinx poets out there that have been speaking to this for a long time. In particular, Mexican American poets whose struggle has risen very much parallel with the civil
Mhm.
rights movement. We're talking about Cesar Chavez and all this, but I mean, I do my own packets, but look for an anthology if you're into poetry, or
Mhm.
even just essays or whatnot by artists, because we're saying there's a power in that, right? When it's not just informational or kind of transactional information, and
Right.
the poets again ground it and make us understand it in a different way, in a much more complex way. So an anthology of Latinx poets would be great if these days just Google it. That's
Yeah.
it. But contemporary, I think, and maybe some historical, but
Yeah.
they help me understand my place in the world. I mean, I didn't, as I said when I read, and I think this is something I saw in my students, that they feel something but they don't even know what the question is, and that's disempowering, right? When I
Mhm.
started writing and when I started reading other Latinx poets, I realized all these questions that I didn't know I had, right,
Right.
right, and
Yeah.
finally found a language with which to have a conversation with myself and then with others.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, Poets, and again artists in general, do that kind of work. They are, uh, I like to call myself and other poets emotional historians, right?
Oh,
They
yeah.
let us know, what does it feel like? What is the issue that nobody's going to talk about in the news, or it's more difficult to find, and it's more intimate. It's something that again can sort of serve to ground you, and with some grounding, there's more empowerment, or at least a better sense of agency, or at least understanding the problem, right? What
Yeah.
underlies what the information we're just getting, right? Um, yeah, I think that's part of what I would recommend.
Okay, so we're about halfway through our podcast, and always at this point, I like to give a shout out to a volunteer. And as we're talking about students and kids and how all of this is affecting them, I think that, and you being from Florida, I think that there is someone who I absolutely should give the shout out to, and that is Aiden. Aiden is a 21-year-old chair of our Students Defending Democracy group. And he is doing exactly like what you said, in that he is kind of getting these kids together to create social media that will impact the movement to defend democracy, which is starting at the school systems. So Aiden, and I always kind of, it just makes me angry sometimes that young people, when I was 21, I wasn't doing this, right? I was starting my life, I was getting my career, I was having fun, I was exploring. um and kids today are absolutely required to, if they want their freedom, to fight for it in a way that we never had to, or I never had to, even though I was involved in certainly many things. So Aiden, enormously grateful to you for doing this. And now back to our conversation here. And I want to talk now about this kind of like top down from the federal government push to destroy the public education system, which includes our libraries, our schools. I never thought, and I'm pretty pessimistic, but I never saw it coming this far this quickly. So, what do you think, as a writer? What do you think the motivation is to for all of the censorship that's happening right now across the country?
Sure, sure. I'll just mention Aiden, right? I think another way that we can feel empowered and less isolated is by obviously community. And like Aiden is doing, right? Like gathering people together, doing something that empowers us. Amanda Gorman's inaugural poem was banned in one of the Florida school districts,
Wow.
and we got together with her. She had donated a bunch of books. A couple of other authors whose publishers donated books got together with the independent bookseller. We had a book giveaway and kind of a little rally, and there was like a two or 300 people there to see like the kids' faces. There's no rule against giving away the books. They might not be in the schools, but we can give them away. And so that's part of also, so you don't feel like the world's just, crashing down on you. And the other piece of that also, in terms of generations, that every generation, I think in some ways there has their moment where there has to be where you step up, so to speak.
Yeah.
In my context, it was not so much immigration, but actually it was more LGBT rights. And we're not talking just marriage equality. We're talking like
Mhm.
campaigning and rallying for just equal opportunity housing, no discrimination, and all this stuff. And so it's to think about it that way. That it's what a pain in the butt that I got to do this, but every generation has some glitch, something that they should
Right.
be step up for, and that's just part of what we should do. So why are they dismantling? What was the question?
What do you think is behind the censorship? I mean, and ultimately, yeah, why are they Because I think that what's behind the censorship is the desire to dismantle public education, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think it's pretty much out of any dictator's playbook, right? If
Mhm.
you control the information, if you don't let people understand history or any context, even recent history, right? Like they're trying to rewrite even that, right? Forget
January
about
6th.
colonial history.
Yeah.
It's a way of disempowering people. If you don't even know what you're fighting, and you have no context to even know what you're fighting or what's happening. I mean, I'll give you an example, and it's interesting for me because I have inherited trauma from my parents being exiles, and
Yeah.
so I even grew up hearing stories and whatnot. But that's one of the first things that Castro did, was example, like
Mhm.
completely revamped the educational system, and the primary goal was to make you a good revolutionary, and that was
Yeah.
it. And everything else, it rewrote Jose Marti, recontextualized the poet Jose Marti now for the revolution. So it's a way of, yeah, I mean, and that I have not, that for me is really new too. I mean, one
Right.
can argue policy and issues, but this is the root of, because if you think the ripple effects of that, someone, a kid who's in fifth grade now, right,
Mhm.
or whatnot,
Right.
is going to grow up without any kind of context, and then without any kind of knowledge, or just will not even know what's going on in a
Right.
way, or how bad it is, right? So I think
Right.
that's definitely one of the yeah one of the strongest ways to do that,
Yeah.
because it's stopping it now and it's stopping generations to come,
Yeah.
and then rewriting and telling the story. Misinformation in a way, no information is misinformation too.
Yeah.
In Florida, we have the Stop Woke Act,
Yep.
which luckily is still an injunction. And that Latinx literature class that I told you about, how am I supposed to teach that without any context of U.S. history and U.S. imperialism and slavery?
Yeah.
And it's like it's yeah. I mean, it's for me. I'm even debating where my career is going, as an instructor. So
Right. I think a lot of people, I mean, and this is opening a whole other can of worms, but I mean, we're living through right now, mass firings of governmental employees for no reason, right? So the economy is going to constrict, and that's very worrisome. And people like you, like me, like what, everybody is everybody's got a big question mark over their heads right now as to what they can plan and what they can do and how they can spend their money. It's very very frightening to me. um Tell me, I really did love the phrase that you said about emotional historians and the power of poetry to be able to do that, because I think we need in this moment to really be creating our own histories and to log it as much as possible. And individuals like yourself are who are kind of the forerunners for doing that are so critical to this. um I always like to kind of end the podcast on a positive note, and I'm wondering if you can share something. I mean, you actually, it's a delight being in your presence, because
okay.
I feel that there's joy here in spite of everything. So let's talk about something positive.
So I think part of my optimism, I got to say, that optimism has been dwindling a bit, but
Mhm.
it's interestingly enough, maybe even ironic, that kind of optimism comes from my parents, who were immigrants and exiles.
Mhm.
And so we grew up with, you know, I got here when I was 45 days old. Technically, I'm an immigrant, but I was 45 days old. And like many of us that got here young or were born here have taken those liberties for granted.
Yeah.
And so I always trace it back to my mother and the struggles that she went through, leaving Cuba, her entire family behind, going to Spain, pregnant with me, 7 months, 50 cents in her pocket, like you read about, and they made it through. And I think that
Mhm.
gives me great hope to understand that, again, maybe my charge is maybe this is a calling too. And there's a
Yeah.
moment in history where we all got to step up. So, in some ways, I guess part of the positiveness is it's giving me work to do, right? It's giving me more sense of purpose. Even though I'm worried about my career and whatnot, in some
Mhm.
ways I'm like, I'm not leaving, you know,
Yeah.
fire me, but I'm going to stay right here. I think we've all been like, musing over moving to another country. Hell no. No, I mean,
Oh, I love it.
you know what I mean? Like it's giving me the sense, well, unless my life is in danger or something like that, or that's
Right.
a whole different story. But I'm like, this is my country, like, and I'm going to fight for it, like, in whatever way I can. So I think that's all. I mean, it's work, but it's positive in a sense that I feel like there's something fulfilling in having something a charge, right? So
Yes.
that's part of it. I think I'm not a historian per se, but I think the other part that's hopeful is that um, things might get worse before they get better. But
Mhm.
isn't there a saying of some kind, like it's like that, no bad lasts or something like that? Like my friend was telling me that Hitler's reign. I mean, granted, what it did was 12 years, really.
Right.
So there's a lot of packed in 12 years, but I feel like there are still some parts of our democracy. We're a young democracy, but we're a democracy sort of. I mean, I know we had slavery, et cetera, but it
Mhm.
was a great social experiment from the beginning.
Yeah.
Now there are countries that yes fall into dictatorships, but also I've never had that stronghold and that, decades or hundreds of years of true, democracy. Does it work
Right.
perfectly? No. Have we had to change it and fight for it and expand that sense of democracy? So in some ways, I feel like even though all this craziness is happening that's around us, I feel like there's some kind of baseline that all Americans understand, and that
Hmm.
once that baseline, once we reach that baseline, that things will start flipping back. Um, I think we kind of see that already in some smaller cases, and people understanding, people that even thought this presidency was something else, and they're all freaking out and like,
Yeah.
well, you kind of said it, but like, everybody can make a mistake,
Representing faces, right? I mean,
Yeah,
like, I love that analogy, but
yeah.
yeah.
Like there are a lot of the Venezuelans in Miami because they're
Yeah.
starting to deport Venezuelans, and a lot of them are protesting now,
Yeah.
and they're very conservative, obviously because of the history in Venezuela, just like Cubans because of their left wing dictatorship kind of experience,
Right.
and even they're like protesting now. They're like, wait. What? No, this is
Yeah.
this is not what we had in mind exactly. But anyway, so that gives me that people will wake up. Um, that kind of silent majority feeling
Yeah.
somehow, and not in the same context as as was used in the past. So that gives me, I wouldn't say hope exactly, cautious hope,
Little.
cautious optimism. And again, enacting in small, like they say with, act global, think globally, act locally.
Yes.
I think that again, that also brings us hope because you realize there's like-minded people around you, and even though sometimes it seems like the minority, at least they're there. That also, again, community, with things like what Aiden is doing, offer
Yes.
its members hope.
Yeah. It really is, and I can't tell you how many people call me up and the first words out of their mouth is, "Thank God you exist. I thought I was all alone." And
Mhm.
that's part of the strategy, right? To make you feel like you're isolated, that you're the only weird one who thinks that this pornography should be in schools, right? Like
Right.
that's part of what they do. And then you realize, you know what? There actually are more good people in this country than bad.
Yeah.
And we need to come together and listen to each other. And also that nobody's going to save us but ourselves.
Yeah. And, this is just because of the topic in general of this podcast.
Mm,
But, also something that kind of gives me hope is that, in a sense, we are still a young country and there are still
mm,
growing pains. And that in some ways, Americans, and again, I have a different perspective because of my parents and whatnot, but Americans have been so naive
mhm.
for so long, you know, and it's a beautiful naivete, but it's also like, you're going to have to face the fact that someone like this presidency is going to come along, and we got to figure out what to do
Yeah.
because it's just going to happen, and things, in other words, for things to get better, sometimes they have to get, because there's a lot of questions we haven't addressed, right? And what Trump is doing has showed up in our society in different ways. It's just now this onslaught, but it's this, some of it was there, but the naivete again of thinking, well, the price of eggs,
Right. Right.
it's, it, it's,
$8 a dozen now, not for nothing, like in my grocery
and
store.
my parents went through part of that,
Yeah.
like, and
Yeah.
then you come to see, what's going on. So in some ways, Americans, again, maybe it's because so many of us have taken those liberties for
Yeah.
granted, and we think
Oh,
that voting on the price of eggs has nothing to do with democracy itself.
yep.
So, so I think there's a little bit of an awakening that I think,
Mhm.
that perhaps moderate people or people that have never really been forced to think about what is the democracy that they've taken for granted all their life, um, might be a somewhat also of a source of optimistic hope. I know my own mother. Cubans are conservative because of just historical content. They're like one
Mhm.
issue voters mostly. It just has to do with whoever they think is fighting for a free Cuba more than the other party. But my mother had a conversion. She voted for Hillary, first time Democrat in her life, and first time for a woman. So she's
Yeah.
87, a woman of that generation, still has woman president, and she's sort of sticking it to her little church lady friends.
Come on.
So like there's
Oh,
little pockets like that, and like she sent me all these funny posts about Trump,
yeah.
and I like my mother was never overtly political in one way or the other, but it's really nice to see her step up and go like, hey, yeah, I'm like,
Whoa.
she's like,
Yeah.
guys, what are you not understanding? This is Castro.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Well, Richard, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. You really added a unique voice and your unique perspective as a poet and a teacher and a gay man and an immigrant. You carry a lot of experience with you, and thank you for sharing it with us today.
thank you for having, like I said, thank God we're not alone. So thank
Mhm.
you for sharing, giving me the opportunity to share those experiences.